I'm sure many of us have a desire to help others and in the long term somehow want to make a difference in this world for the better. But how exactly do we go about doing that? I'll never forget the time I attended the funeral of a Christian man who was very well liked and respected in his community, in the church that he was with. He was kind of one of those guys who, whenever he spoke, everybody listened. And it wasn't the respect that he had, it wasn't because he was rich or he had some kind of church office. It wasn't because he had some kind of high-ranking government office. He was an average guy, but it was because of his character and the way he lived his Christian life. And I'll never forget the words that the preacher at his funeral said about him. He noted that this guy's life shows us that you do not have to be an elder and you do not have to be a preacher in order to be a leader and influence people for God. You see, our Christian walk can either hinder people or help people. I want to share with you a passage of Scripture in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Paul had established the church at Thessalonica, as you see back in the book of Acts, and he had warned them, and just as he said, they were undergoing tribulation and persecution on account of just being Christians. And Paul hadn't heard for a while as to how they were doing, and so he was very concerned about their faith. And so as you pick up in reading in verse 5, it says, "For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, he said, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and watch this, our labor might be in vain." Think about that phrase, our labor might be in vain. That implies at the very outset that a Christian can lose their salvation, by the way. But it also means, if you think about all the time and effort and energy Paul spent in teaching them the gospel, converting them to Christ, and then building them up in their faith, helping them grow in their faith, all of that was in one sense in vain or a waste if they so decided to walk away from God. What about us? Think about all of the time and energy people have invested in us and in our faith. Think about all the prayers that people have said on our behalf. Think about all the times we've been counseled by others on big decisions or problems maybe we've had in our life. Think about all the Bible class teachers and sermons that we've heard throughout the years. A lot of people have invested a lot of time and energy into our faith, haven't they? And to just decide one day to walk away from God and no longer to be faithful to Him is in one sense and in a lot of ways a waste. You see, the way we live our lives as Christians can be, again, a help or a hindrance. And when we decide to turn our back on God, for those who are still faithful, can be very disheartening and actually very discouraging. Thankfully, though, the church at Thessalonica, or the Christians there, were not like that. When Paul heard from Timothy how they were doing and how they were still strong and steadfast in the Lord in spite of their afflictions and their persecutions, Paul then says this in verse 7. He says, "Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith." Now, I don't know exactly what Paul was going through. I know he went through some really hard times, and it sounds like it was one of them. But in the midst of all of the hardships Paul was facing, a source of encouragement, that shot in the arm, and that comfort he talks about here, all came from just one thing: that Christians at Thessalonica were still Christians, and they were still living for the Lord. Don't ever underestimate the good that you do by just being a faithful Christian. In that way alone, we probably do more good than what we'll ever realize.